this is Andrea Dunkel and Elizabeth Cordova, and we did our evidence-based practice paper on the role of genetics and dopamine in ADHD. This is just a little background on the disorder. ADHD, if you didn't know, stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is most often characterized by the inability to concentrate, and it most often gets diagnosed early on in life because that's when the onset occurs. Usually is either in childhood or adolescence. The research problem that we looked into was being able to properly diagnose, properly treat, research on the prognosis of this disorder, what causes the disorder, and what role does genetics play into this. And here we're going to look into each one of those. Our PICO question was, how does the role of genetics and dopamine affect the diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis of children and adolescents with ADHD? And how does the treatment of this disorder with stimulant medications compare to that of alternative therapies? Why investigate this problem? Well, this is a big part of nursing, and it's good to be aware of it so that we can have more knowledge and make improvements in our healthcare system. And also the use of evidence-based practice is very important in this research because it can help researchers and nurses know what works and what doesn't work as far as with diagnosing, treating, and possibly curing one day. Here we're going to go through our description of studies. We have 6 of them. So this first study that we had was a quantitative study. The purpose of this study was to show that the dysfunction in the reward pathway plays a role in ADHD and to demonstrate the correlation between dopamine levels and motivation. The description of the sample size had a good number of participants, 86. Participants in the sample were either healthy controls with no ADHD symptoms or unmedicated symptomatic ADHD participants. It says that the setting was not specified in this particular study. How they collected their data was through evaluation of ADHD symptoms first to make sure that each participant did in fact have the disorder, and they compared that with dopamine levels in the brain between 2 different groups. They utilized the tools called the SWAN, which stands for Weaknesses of ADHD Symptoms and Normal Behavior. They also used a rating scale, CARS, C-A-A-R-S, along with multidimensional personality questionnaire, MPQ, that measured personality. Also, the use of positron emissions tomography was used. The significant findings here correlated between achievement and dopamine. Those were found to be significant for dopamine receptors, which compared with the controls, the ADHD participants had significantly lower measurements of dopamine availability in the brain. Another description of studies was also, this one was a qualitative study. The purpose of this was to demonstrate that young people prefer the use of stimulant medications. Description of the sample size included 16 young boys and girls ranged in ages from 14 years old, or 9 to 14 years old. All 16 of the participants had been clinically diagnosed with ADHD and were currently taking stimulant medication for their disorder. So they were on methamphetamines. Data collection method. They collected the data by the use of games or focus groups, one-on-one sessions. All interviews and group sessions were recorded, transcribed, and analyzed using quantitative coding practices that exhibited validity and relevance. The significant findings in this was that the young people did in fact feel that stimulant medication was the best treatment for ADHD. And they used two different themes in this one also, the perception of impact of medication and knowledge about and attitudes toward the medication. Another description of studies is this other quantitative study, which was also informative. The purpose of this was it focused on the onset of ADHD in children, as well as the development of the disorder throughout a course of 5 years. So it had information from a previous study 5 years ago, and then the current study that was what I was focusing on was the one that they used the children from the previous study, the previous 5 years ago study. So it helped to see the course that the disorder had taken in those 5 years in the children's lives. So it examined the genetic side of the research on ADHD and the role of the dopamine D4 receptor gene. Like I said before, the original study had 375 children, and the present longitudinal study included 151 children from that previous study. They had to be age 12 and over, so that's why they couldn't use all 375 of those children, because most of the children weren't yet 12 years old. The data collection method for the collection of information from the parents of the subjects. A phone interview was set up with the interviewer. The interviewer had previously been trained by a child psychiatrist. They collected DNA in a laboratory, and teachers also were able to observe the children in a classroom setting. Some significant findings was that the results of these genetic variances were able to predict persistence of ADHD into adolescence. And they did find something interesting in this one. The DRD4 7 repeat allele is what may predict the developmental course of the disorder. So it's saying here that DRD4 and DRD5 both correlate with ADHD, but the DRD4 7 repeat allele is the main part of your DNA that predicts the course of the disorder. So that was a pretty significant finding there. Okay, and now Elizabeth is going to read you the rest of them.
The next study in our description of studies was a qualitative and explanatory study. Its main purpose was to understand the relationship between ADHD and its relationship between sleep disturbances by conducting an exploratory research study on two groups, a group of young adults and then a broader sample of older adults. Basically, there was sample 1, which included 301 undergraduate and graduate students, and they were all from Romanian universities. The population in sample 2 included 250 participants from the general community with a broader age, and it was a broader age group. And they were recruited by online or local mass media. The participants in the study provided demographic data and completed multiple self-report written tests. The way data was collected for this study, it was 3 different categories, such as 3 different categories were tested, like ADHD symptoms and sleep disturbances and diurnal preference. The Pearson's R statistical test was the one used to measure the correlation values between the variables. For this study, significant findings included that ADHD symptoms were more severe in young adults than in those with ADHD or chronic insomnia, while inattention was found to be linked to disturbed sleep. The next description of study was a qualitative study, and its purpose was to identify if this Chinese herb Ningdong or NDG was safe and effective when compared to methylphenidate. And methylphenidate is a medication that is usually used for treatment of ADHD. So they were basically seeing whether an herb was better than using a regular pharmacy medication. The sample consisted of 72 children, and they were the ages between 6 and 13. They all had to meet the DSM, the fourth DSM diagnostic criteria for ADHD, so they all had to actually be diagnosed with ADHD. When processing or collecting the data between the side effects of NDG and methylphenidate, they used evaluations from teachers, parents, and psychiatrists evaluating their symptoms. And also it included blood and urine and stool samples just to determine the rates or how much medication or herb was in the child, and to monitor the safety of this herb. Dopamine and hemonovalic acid levels were also tested. All the significant findings, basically, what this research helped prove was that the alternative treatments for ADHD, what didn't prove to, have to be better than methylphenidate, but it did have less side effects. So that was the main thing, that this natural herb had less side effects than the regular methylphenidate. The next the next study was a quantitative study. And in this study, researchers attempted to answer whether genetics played a role in the response of treatment of ADHD. The main concept was to identify if behavioral parental training outcomes were affected by the dopamine in children with ADHD. So they were trying to figure out whether this dopamine gene affected how children reacted to this certain therapy that they were trying out. The sample size was of 50 children, and these children were referred and they were known to have participated in another study, and so they were pulled from that study and asked to participate in this study as well. They collected the data of this study through behavioral scales, just recording how the child's symptoms and their symptoms of ADHD, along with comparing it to their brain scans as recording how much dopamine was in their brain, basically. So they did brain scans and then compared those with how the child behaved. So the main finding for the study was that children who had the DAT1 10 receptor alleles demonstrated no difference between behavioral parental training or RCC or RCC alone. So for all the findings, all grouped together, they're mostly all similar. Most of them were of quantitative design, and only one was qualitative for our paper. All the findings in the article were applicable to the research question. Two articles were about, how low dopamine levels as well as dopamine transmitters play a role in ADHD. The other articles focus mostly on treatment options for ADHD and whether, herbs or medications were best. The other two articles that we used helped explore the genetic side of ADHD and helped to identify whether genetics played a role in either the treatment or the diagnosis or the prognosis of ADHD. For now, what we can do with this information, policy is still uncertain as to what specifically causes ADHD, but with this research, with some of these research findings, it's becoming a little bit more apparent that DNA and genes do play a role in the disorder, and maybe the reason why these dopamine transmitter pathways are impaired may be because of the DRD447 repeat allele. The policy section of the diagnosing ADHD is similar to what is currently being practiced in ADHD. What we found most controversial for this paper was how ADHD was treated, because the policy stated that stimulant medications were better than alternative therapies, but as one of the papers suggested, it showed that alternative therapies had less side effects than stimulant medication. So whatever treatment option that works best for that particular person with ADHD should be continued. By implementing these findings into the healthcare field and nursing practice, and the whole ADHD process can be improved significantly. Proper diagnosing will help isolate those with real problems, and proper treatment will also help those with the disorder have higher levels of functionality. Discovering more about the prognosis will also assist with the better outcomes for these individuals with ADHD as they age. So as we continue to explore more about the role of genetics and dopamine in ADHD, maybe it will help possibly discover the cure for this disorder or stop it before it even starts. In conclusion, this issue is significant because a lot of children now in our community suffer from ADHD, and it's sad that between 2 to 5% of high school age population are the ones that do have to be referred to pediatric psychiatrists because of this disorder. Nurses and healthcare providers should want to know more about this because they are the ones who are, providing recommendations for assessment and for diagnosing and for treatment of people with this condition. And we should be a gateway for these people to get better treatment options so that they can manage their symptoms and be able to live their lives more functionally. While teachers and parents are often the first to notice a developmental problem with a child, it is our job to properly assess, diagnose, and treat this illness. So the problems, findings, and utilization in this research paper impacted the profession of nursing by exploring all parts of this disorder to further understand it and to cure it hopefully one day with the use of evidence-based practice and research. And these are our references that we used. And that is it. Thank you for listening.